Hello， 大家好，我是利恩。我们之前做过2期非常受到大家广泛热烈回响的影片，都是有关于言论自由。那在我们开始今天的这第3期深入探讨言论自由的影片之前呢，我会非常强烈的推荐，如果还没有看过前2期的朋友呢，好，不妨务必先去把这2期看完。前面这2期如果看完了，你可能会更好的跟我们一起深入的去理解。这一次我要带大家进入一个更深层次的角度去看待言论自由。而毫无例外，我们仍然要请到我们地表最强的临床心理学家 Jordan Peterson 乔老爷子呢，在一次加拿大的公开演讲，就深入的来谈言论自由的重要性，以及它真实内涵的含义，是帮助我们解决与他人之间人际沟通上的方方面面问题。那你可能会觉得奇怪了，这言论自由不就是你想说什么说什么吗？这个有什么好改变自己的说话方式？好，所以呢，我会把重要的精华的分享放在片尾。那到野子过程当中，我可能会临时穿插几个简单的补充。就让我们一起来看看乔老爷子这一次要告诉我们的是，为什么在临床心理学上，言论自由如此的重要，以及它甚至可以直接影响帮助你的生活。我们一起来看 ，Let's go.
Wonderful to be here. This is such a remarkable place, and for a Canadian in particular, with our rather, what would you say, paucity of history, it's really something to come here and see a place that's so saturated with, I would say, beauty and integrity. I hope you know what you have and that you take careful care of it, because it certainly deserves it. I'm going to speak tonight as a clinician, I would say, about free speech. Dr. Orr gave a bit of an account of the battle behind the scenes, so to speak, that took place so that I could come here and talk, and that's much appreciated. A lot of people put a lot on the line to make this possible. But I find the debate itself somewhat of a mystery. I can't really understand why it's raging precisely the way it is raging. And I would say that specifically from a clinical perspective. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a clinician named Carl Rogers, and I learned something. I've studied the people I regard as the great clinicians in some detail and learned a lot from all of them, regardless of their particular school of psychotherapeutic endeavor, let's say, or their historical background or their genre. I learned a lot from Freud in the psychoanalysis, from Carl Jung, from Rogers, who was a humanist, from Maslow, who was perhaps equally outstanding as a humanist psychologist, the existential psychologists, and the cognitive behavioral types, who were much more cut and dried, let's say, in their approach than the more mythologically oriented, narrative-oriented psychoanalysts. They all had something to teach me, and I learned it with great, what would you say? I was driven by a great need to learn what they had to say, and thank God for that. Since they were clinicians, you'd hope that reading what they wrote would be helpful, and it certainly was helpful to me personally, practically in the conduct of my profession, but then also in my interpersonal relationships. Unbelievably helpful. And I would say the most stellar piece of advice that I ever encountered that was actually both, I would say, profound in some sense, but also immediately practical, came from Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers did an awful lot of clinical research into clinical efficacy, as well as being a rather admirable theorist. Now, his background is somewhat germane. He was really an evangelical Protestant up until the time he became a young man. He was going to go to China as a missionary and stopped because of his developing agnosticism, and then I would say atheism, as a consequence of his inability to reconcile the distinction between science and religion. But his clinical thinking is saturated with Judeo-Christian suppositions. And foremost upon them, I would say, would be something like respect for the word in capital, as a capitalized phrase, respect for the divine word, let's say, but in a secularized fashion. But Roger was also extraordinarily careful, I would say, to elaborate beyond the word to the act of the exchange of words, let's say, because for anyone to speak, in some sense, you need a listener. And what that means is that if you're going to be a participant in a good conversation, or we might even say a therapeutic conversation, that not only do you have to be an active speaker, but you have to be, to use a terribly cliched phrase, an active listener. And it stays a cliche unless you understand what it means. But if you understand what it means, then it can stop being a cliche. And I can tell you that if you take nothing else from this lecture, but you practice this, it will completely transform the way that you interact with people. And that's something that's worth noting too, that something like this can in fact completely transform the way that you interact with people, and that it's actually something in some sense that's simple enough to learn in a very short period of time. So Roger said that he had noted in his interactions with people and in the clinical domain that it was very difficult for people to listen, and that most people had never really been listened to at all, or that many had never been listened to at all, never really attended to properly, let's say, by their parents during their course of development, never had a mentor or a teacher who really attended to them and listened. And Rogers also noted that you listening may be thinking that that's not true of you. Let's say as a person, you had people who guided you, or as a listener, you're perfectly good at it. And he would say, no, probably not. And so he posited a little experiment that you could run, and I would highly recommend that you run this experiment every time you talk to people for the rest of your life, because it really works. And it points to something deep that we'll go into after the description of the practicalities. So Rogers said, it was an axiom of his theoretical stance, let's say, and derived it in no small part from the Freudian revelations. I mean, basically what Freud did in his clinical practice was have people come into his office, his clinic, lay down on a couch with him not visible, and talk. And the instruction was, say anything that comes to mind, anything and everything that comes to mind. So completely untrammeled, revelatory thought. Now, Freud's observation was that if you let people do that and maintained an active listening environment, even though you were hidden, he didn't want you to be dissuaded or persuaded in your utterances by any reflection of emotion on his face, that you would just have the opportunity to wander haphazardly through your field of thought. And what Freud came to realize was that the haphazard nature of that tended to transform rather quickly into something that was much more coherent and much less contaminated with excess emotion. And so that if you just let the revelatory process of free speech occur, that in itself was therapeutic. And that was a radical claim for its time. But in some sense, it's not that radical at all, unless you think that speech is divorced entirely from thought, which it certainly is not, although thought cannot be reduced merely to speech, because there are forms of thought that are imagistic, let's say, but certainly much of what goes on in the theaters of our imagination that constitutes thought is in the form of speech.
在心理学方面，我个人其实也非常欣赏弗洛伊德的心理分析派。特别在弗洛伊德《梦的解析》这本书当中，他其实就提到说，大部分做梦的意境如果一个好的解梦者要去解决梦的含义的话，最好的第一个方式其实是让这个做梦的人呢，在分享他梦的经验的时候，直觉联想到的事情是，当你能够给人一个非常安全的环境，让人能够自由的去发表的时候呢，其实人心里面梦的深层次背后的隐藏的含义，或者是被压抑的感受呢，人是有办法、有能力自己用语言组织起来，并且能够说清楚的。弗洛伊德他帮人做解析梦境的时候，他发现绝大多数做梦者本身其实都有能力自我回答他梦的意境，而且他发现那个准确率非常的高。这个就是反映了乔尔耶兹所说的，一个环境它让人的言论足以是安全的时候，其实是可以超越很多情绪性的字眼。很多人认为网络上会有很多的这些所谓的暴言暴语，可是这个其实相对的是缺乏的一件事情，是因为你无法从网络上感受到被倾听，所以对于言论自由的来讲，一个好的倾听者就非常的重要。而换另外一个角度讲，其实倾听是我们促进言论自由的很重要的一步，因为我们允许别人言论自由，我们才越有可能去倾听清楚他内心真实的想法。OK， 我们继续看。
You could say, well, we think with speech, and thought is in many ways internalized speech. And so the notion that allowing yourself to notice what you actually think about things by talking about them might be good for you if thought is in some important sense linked to, well, your bodily incarnation, let's say. And if it's not, well, then what good is it? And so, technically speaking, the part of the brain that produces semantic content, the prefrontal cortex, usually in the left, but it depends to some degree on lateralization and handedness. We don't have to get into that. The prefrontal cortex grew out of the motor cortex in the course of evolutionary history. And so what happens in the theater of thought is that potential actions and perceptions are tried out for potential utility, so they're revealed in a sense, and then potentially criticized out of existence before you implement them stupidly in behavior and die. And I believe it was Alfred North Whitehead said, the purpose of thought is to let our thoughts die instead of us, which is correct, right? It's correct biologically, it's correct technically, it's correct philosophically, and it's worth thinking about.
好，这边我帮忙补充一下啊，意思就是说，我们人在对于周遭的环境，常常都一定会先有一个潜在的感知，对吧？就是你还没有组织语言说出来之前，其实你就已经会先有一个感受，或者说一个感觉。但是一个人他如果是被允许言论自由的表达的话呢，他更容易先透过一层理性的思考，也就是自己可能在还没有做出这个错误、这个愚蠢的行为之前的时候，你自己就会有一番自我的评估，说，我刚刚这样的想法，我刚刚这样的感受，我有这个冲动想要这样去做的时候，是不是其实本身就是不对的，或是错误的，对吧？因为你已经会去假设。你已经说出来或是做出来的结果，用你的想法去模拟了你说出来可能的情况。好，那因此你已经模拟了之后，你的理性就会判断告诉你说，当你如果这样子说，结果可能会是不好的。就是充分的自由的思想，就帮助我们在理性上面更容易去达到所谓的代替风险管理。换句就是他刚刚讲的，想法就会代替我们去死掉，避免我们真的去犯傻去死掉。
Well, Freud let people reveal themselves to themselves. Now, later investigations, particularly by James Pennebaker, showed that the Freudian transformation, insofar as it did occur, say in relationship to trauma, was not a consequence of emotional catharsis, which was part of Freud's essential hypothesis, although he was more sophisticated than that, but actually a consequence of the cognitive reconstruction and reappraisal that occurred attendant upon speech related, let's say, to trauma, to revelatory speech related to trauma. Now, there are other ways of engaging in such things. There's the pure revelatory explication, and so one of the things you do as a clinician, you try your best, is so when someone would come and see me, well, first they were very tentative because who the hell wants to go see a clinical psychologist, right? I mean, you only do such a thing if you're driven to desperation in some sense. You have to admit to yourself that you're no longer capable of dealing with your own affairs, or that at least something could be improved, and you have to turn to a relative outsider. So it's a somewhat humiliating initial endeavor. And I would say if you ever know anyone who needs to be convinced to see a psychologist because things have got out of hand, one way to smooth the way forward to that is just to tell them to try it once, right? Because then it's not a long-term commitment. And I would tell people when they walked in my office, well, we'll see how this goes. And I know you're uncomfortable about being here and disoriented and all that, but let's try it out for one session. And if it works, then you could have another one, and then you could decide again then. And so, it's a gentle introduction. I would never assume to begin with that I knew what was wrong with them. I was never striving for a diagnosis, and that was partly because I was formally trained as a cognitive behavioral psychologist, and cognitive behavioral psychologists are much more concerned with the particularities of perception and behavior than with such things as psychiatric diagnostic categories. And so it was a very strategic approach, and one that was really based on a gentle and facilitating inquisition. It's like, well, there must be something wrong in your life, I would presume, because here you are, or you're trying to make something that isn't so good better. That's another possibility. I wouldn't presume to know what that is, because what do I know about you? Like nothing. And so a lot of the initial discussion was just, well, what's wrong? Like, as far as you can tell, how would you describe in as detailed a fashion as possible what's wrong? And then if things weren't wrong, well, what might they look like? So, and that's a great thing, by the way, if you're ever arguing with someone in an intimate relationship, right? Because there's some issue on the table, and one of the things you can ask them is, well, what are your conditions for satisfaction? Like, if this was resolved to your satisfaction, what is it that I would have to offer? What is it that would have to change that I could actually practically implement right now? And one way of doing that, by the way, is sometimes the person wants you to say something, an apology maybe, and you have to agree that perhaps you should utter an apology, but you can say to them, well, what words should I couch this apology in that would be sufficient as far as you're concerned? And they're going to say, well, you have to figure that out on your own, or if you loved me, you'd know. And that's like, no, I'm stupid. And I don't know what would satisfy you, and I'm awkward at these sorts of things, and I could use a hand at practice, and so maybe if you just let me stumble through this apology in the manner that you see fit as a genuine actor, then maybe the next time I do it, I'd be a little better at it. But don't expect satiating perfection first utterance, because you're not going to get it, because you're likely tangled up with someone who's no more sophisticated or intelligent than you are. So that's very helpful. So the clinical sessions were as free an exchange of information as I could manage. And one of the things I did notice consistently in my clinical practice was that if I really, really listened to the person, they were unbelievably interesting. And so I would say, this is rather corrosive bit of self-reflection, but if you're bored in a conversation, you're the boring person. Right? Because you're not listening. Because if you were listening, that person is a strange creature, man. And if they told you what they are actually up to, first of all, it'd be a shock to them, that's for sure. But if they were telling you, you would not be bored.
乔老爷子这边我是非常有感的哈。其实这就像我们常常在讲当你很认真想要倾听一个人的时候呢，你才会觉得哇，原来我们之间好不一样，想法好不同然后你会觉得好怪你怎么会这样想呢？对吧？可是如果你是认真倾听的话，你才有机会允许对方把他更真实的想法自由的表达出来。换句话说，言论的自由其实它反面过来的价值就是帮助我们倾听。我们如果越对别人的话语给予禁止或者是打压的话，我们更对别人更没有好奇，更无所谓倾听嘛，甚至我认为那个是无用。我甚至禁止你，因为我认为你可能讲出来的东西就是有害的。可是这个缺点是相对的，我们除了让别人更无法自由的表达自己之外，我们其实也失去了倾听的功能。像 Jordan Peterson 这样的临床心理学家来讲，其实心理学家他们是最崇尚言论自由。为什么？因为他最渴望的就是所有的接受这个所谓心理治疗的对象呢，都能够去自由的表达他最真实的想法，所以他一定要创造一个言论自由环境。当然也许你会说到那可是这样也要对方愿意倾听我没错，所以我必须要告诉大家，这个是相辅相成的。你积极的主张言论自由，也是帮助你能够更有包容性去倾听。换句话说，如果你是一个愿意更倾听的人的话，你一定也会对对方哪怕是冒犯性或者是攻击性的言语会更感兴趣，变成会更好奇，想知道你会不会是有什么话还没有说出来，还没有讲清楚的，你的言论可能还没有完全的把你的自由表达出来。这样了解我意思吗？我们继续看。
And so there's a high probability that you're sitting there thinking what you already know about this person, what you're assuming by the way they're dressed or the way they comport themselves or their class or their social status or their ethnicity or whatever the hell it is, stereotypes that you're using as a replacement for the genuine dialogue. And then you're also sitting there thinking about what you're going to say next when they're talking so that you can impress them and so on and so forth. And you're not doing the kind of listening that Rogers suggested at all, because you're treating the other person as an end to an a priori defined instrumental means. And that's a big mistake. And so Rogers thought you could check yourself. And here's the experiment. And this works in a lovely manner. And actually, Rogers' work has been used in conflict management, sociology, and management at fairly high levels of governmental intervention, especially in times of war. Because it actually does make peace. And it's so his rule was, well, first of all, you're going to be afraid to listen. Because if you listen to someone who disagrees with you, and you really listen, they're going to tell you things that will reveal your errors and make you change. And now that might be a good thing if you know that you're so damn ignorant that a little humility is in order and that the better you could be given rise to in place of the already totalitarian certainty, that constitutes you at the moment. But still, it's especially if you're dealing with someone who truly is different than you. The probability that they'll reveal things in honest dialogue that will shake you to the core is quite high. And that's very common experience in clinical practice. Well, partly why else would it possibly work if that wasn't the sort of thing that was happening. And so that was another barrier to listening, is you don't want the person to reveal themselves in their complexity to some degree, because they shake you to the depths of your core certainties. And that's actually a great thing unless you're already living in paradise, right? Because since you're not, the probability that you're existing in error is fairly high, and some of those errors are probably pretty severe, but that doesn't mean it's a particularly pleasant experience to have them revealed or to stumble upon them. So Roger suggested this technique, which I said I would get to the technique. He said, the next time you find yourself embroiled in an argument with someone that's contentious and uncomfortable, say, institute the following rule. You don't get to respond to the person's claims until they've exhausted that particular claim, and this does presume to some degree that you're dealing with a good faith actor, even if they feel differently than you do. You don't get to respond until you have recapitulated their viewpoint and summarized it in a manner they find acceptable. That's so treacherously sneaky, that rule, because what it means is you have to demonstrate that you attended to what they say closely enough and carefully enough to, first of all, act out validation of the idea that they have an opinion worth attending to. So that's a big deal. Eh? People really like being paid attention to. There's nothing people like more than that, unless they have something to hide. And even then, there's a part of them that would rather have that paid attention to than fail to pass, what would you say, to go unnoticed. Every cynic is entirely disappointed when his or her cynicism goes unchallenged, because there's a part of them, like a little unwarped part of their soul, that's still alive, thinking, oh my God, I hope someone calls me on all my foolishness and cynicism, because if they don't, that means that it's valid and generally applicable, and I'm in hell, and what good is that? And I really mean that. I really mean that. And so you're called upon to, first of all, summarize what they said, which is not an easy thing, right? Because it means you have to, and sometimes it's somewhat incoherent and emotion-laden, especially if it's in the course of an argument. So you have to sort of strike right to the quick. It sounds to me like this is the point you were making. And then you lay out the point, and then you see they have to be happy with your summary. They have to be pleased with it, which means that you're doing exactly the opposite of straw-manning the argument, quite the contrary. And you're doing them a favor in some sense by reducing it to the gist, because that's actually an incredibly complex cognitive operation. I had one client who was extraordinarily seriously affected, and in the final analysis, I don't know if I was of any help to her, because the pit of family pathology she was ensconced in was so deep that no matter how far we dug, there was always a new layer of lies underneath the lies we had already worked months to uncover. It was just awful, like homicidal level awful, literally terrible. But she told me she went on a tangent that lasted for 4 consecutive day clinical sessions. Like, they weren't the whole day, but they were 50 minutes on 4 consecutive days. I had no idea where she was going. She was wandering all over in this Freudian associational manner, and she came to the point at the end of it. It was unbelievable. She tied together she was a very intelligent woman. She tied together this tremendously long, incoherent ramble into a little bow right at the end, like the punchline of a remarkable joke. And she had extracted, in some sense, the gist of what she was saying as a consequence of the circumambulation, the wandering through all this territory. And when you listen to someone very, very carefully, and especially if they express themselves for a while, and you say to them, well, it sounds to me like this is what you're saying, what you're doing is taking a tremendous amount of emotionally laden material, a lot of it unnecessary in the final analysis because of the ensuing synthesis, and offering them a synthesis, which is a great thing to do, especially if they're happy to accept it, because that also means that you did listen to them. So you signified that they were worth attending to, and then you listened to them enough to actually understand what they were saying, to try to understand it, and then you did understand it. And then they're way happier with you, even if you're arguing with them, because at least now they know they can rely on you to be a reliable listener, and that you're not trying to, you know how it is when you're arguing with someone, there's a part of you that really wants to win. It's like, I'm right, you're stupid and wrong. And so the best way for me to demonstrate that is to warp and bend your argument make it trivial in some way it isn't, especially if it's directed to some degree at like elucidating my character flaws and to minimize you in doing so. And if you do that, of course, well, that's not a great road to peace unless you're willing to bring a big club to the argument, and many people are. And instead of listening and trying to make peace and sort things out, they'll use all sorts of subtle forms of suppression in their ensuing dialogue just to keep everything, under the rug or in the closet. I wouldn't recommend that as a medium to long-term strategy, especially if you're trying to bring peace to a household. You have to go through this horribly painful process of listening to the people around you tell you what they think of their lives. And if you do that, then, well, maybe you can all come to a place that is characterized by something approximating genuine peace. And I would say that even psychophysiologically, when there's tension in a household and multiple what would you say, systems of value operating simultaneously, there's a tremendous confusion about what should reign supreme, right? And you think, well, nothing has to reign supreme. We can all have our diverse opinions. No, you can't. Not if you're going to live together in harmony. There has to be some overarching structure that unites you. What else is a family if it's not an overarching structure that unites you? Now, within that, there can be tolerance and even appreciation for necessary individual differences, and obviously there should be, but that doesn't mean there's not a higher unity that the entire organization, let's say, is striving for in some manner, and not only striving for, but pining for, or even dying for. And I don't use those words lightly. Like the absence of that incorporating higher structure is a felt sense of catastrophe on the part of the members of the family. They're always at each other's throats. They're interfering with each other's goals. They can't listen. They're in a chronic state of hyper-arousal because they don't know what to do ever. They're hopeless because no goals have been clearly defined, and we experience almost all our hope in relationship to defined goals. So this isn't some, what would you say, humanity's myth or some reality that isn't as concrete as everything that you see before you. It's quite the contrary. And as far as Rogers was concerned, well, you had to let people talk to find out what they thought, so they could find out what they thought, so they could move towards something, so they could move away from hell.
这里有另外一个更深层的言论自由的价值。我们常常会觉得说言论自由就是要忍受，或者说要允许别人很多这些充满暴力啦，或者是负面的声音，没有错。这种情绪性的或者是歧视性的字眼或声音在表达的时候，确实，它对于听者来讲，可能都会认为这是一种言语暴力。但是第一个，就像我之前说的，你都有拒绝聆听的自由，而对方也必须尊重你的自由。但是从某种角度来讲，当这样的声音允许它被发泄出来之后，有的时候是帮助他们能够远离真正地狱的问题，就是免得他们真的行为化的去犯罪。这个有一点像什么？如果今天我们允许别人发表出好比说一个恐怖思想，当他的想法说出来的时候，会有人给予谴责，或者说有人拒绝聆听嘛？他这个声音被出来的，所以有人能够谴责他，或者说有人能够用更有耐心的角度去询问他为什么会这样想，更倾听他内心里头是什么事情导致了他会有这样子的一个看法。而在这样子一个充满对话的状况当中，很有可能其实是帮助了他，避免了他真正在行为上掉到不可挽救的深渊里头，而不是因为压抑而使得他只能用攻击或者说泄恨的言语去表达，对吧？因为他的背后反映的可能是他觉得没有被尊重，没有人在倾听他。就好像我们讲为什么政府要允许人民有集会游行的权利，其实是这样，集会游行当然是一群人在那边表达出一个很强烈的情绪才会上街集会游行嘛。那为什么要这样？其实这样就是允许他的情绪被看见，能够允许他内心里可能他用理性上说不出或者说讲不清楚的东西能够被理解，所以其实是一个帮助人们去更好的去用理性去厘清自己的一个管道。因为在那个过程当中里头，人们去思考说，
我们这样上街，我们的抗议，我们的诉求，好，到底有没有办法说服大众？其实他才有反思的机会。如果全部压抑的禁止人们没有机会有情况，其实想法只能容易变得更偏激或更变极端，因为他只想要先第一争取的是被看见嘛，那就会采用更激烈的手段去渴望达到被看见。那如果连他渴望被看见这被压制的话，那我只能说，人民终究活在的是一个精神思想的痛苦里头。那这个就比较容易是发生在集权或是共产国家里头会有的现象。
Because that's certainly what you see in clinical practice. I mean, people are suffering in ways you can hardly, well, you can probably imagine, because no doubt many of you have either been there or seen people who were there, lived with them. You know, to move away from that's more real than anything else. If pain is more real than anything else, what's even more real than pain is whatever we have to fight off the pain. And that's free speech. It's identical with freedom of thought. It's associated with this capacity and necessity to listen deeply. They're flip sides of the same coin, to use a terrible cliche. And all the clinical data we have, including the more stringently research-oriented clinical inquiry, indicates quite clearly that the exchange of information like that, the generation of semantic and emotional information in a state of relative freedom, the revelation of those thoughts, and then the discursive analysis of those thoughts, say, and then the implementation into action and the testing of them, that is the pathway to health, insofar as that can be attained by, say, psychological or spiritual means. And so that's why free speech is not just another freedom or right among many. It's certainly not viewpoint diversity or anything like that. It's the mechanism by which we generate the conceptions that allow us to organize our experience in the world. It's that mechanism. And more than that, it's the mechanism that allows us to reformulate and criticize those conceptions when they've become outdated and sterile, to dissolve them into a chaos that we have to contend with while it's occurring, and then to reanimate them in a new form so that we can move into the future. And so if you're concerned with the oppressed, let's say, why in the world would you oppose free speech? It's the only thing the oppressed have. And if you don't understand that, I would say, well, that's either an ignorance that's so deep that you should remediate it as rapidly as possible, or a malevolence that's so appalling that you should face it even though you'll face it at your peril. And so you come to a university like this that's been a bastion of free speech, in a country that's been a bastion of free speech and a light unto the world in that regard for 1,000 years, and all due credit to all of you for that. It's like, don't forget this. This is the fundamental thing. Say, the entire Judeo-Christian enterprise to this date has been an attempt, in some sense, to elevate to the highest place the notion of the divine redemptive word. And there's no truth that's deeper than that. And that's that. So, thank you very much.
其实大家可以换个角度去想，你真的认为一个人他所有讲出来的话都是自由的吗？我举一个很简单的例子，如果一个人从小他在原生家庭里头，他是长期被压抑，不允许他去表达他自己的真实感受的时候，那这个人长大的时候，他很有可能属于那一种讲话就容易动脾气，或者是动辄就有情绪而不自知的人。因为他在跟别人讲话的时候，他可能就容易言语急躁，甚至容易指责或攻击别人。
否则我就骂臭他祖宗18代，
对吧？反过来讲，讨好型的人也是，讨好型的人，因为他不觉得他内在真实的想法是被人足以重视的，所以他已经习惯了用迂回的方式，想要试图先去满足别人，而进而才希望别人能够愿意多花一点时间聆听他内心真实的想法。可是这个习惯循环往复下来，其实讨好型的人也没有办法能够清楚地表达自己内心真实的声音，对吧？所以我必须要给大家一个观念。 我们看到所有的，包含你认为别人的言论是带有情绪性的、攻击性的，你认为这些东西都应该是被压抑或被禁止，或者说甚至我们要小心这种相关可能引起的煽动的话，其实这些声音如果越被压抑的话，其实人们呢会相对的越无法表达自己内心的真实。这就是并不是每个人都能够真实的表达自己内心真实的想法。换句话说，尽管你以为你有言论自由，可是你未必你的言论是自由的。不要说，如果是在集权国家或共产国家的话，你的言论会某种程度上带有一定程度的风险意识，一定会去担心有些特别敏感性，好比说谈论到政府的，谈论到国家元首的，你可能心里面就会觉得很无法完全真实的表达内心的感受，对吧？那更不要说就是有的人已经长期习惯于这样子的一种状况之下呢，他甚至会反过来认同或支持国家以及政府对人民的控管，他反而会认为就是因为我们缺少了这些负面的或者说情绪性的声音被听见，所以这个国家才会相对的变得更健康、更美好。但真的是如此吗？大家不要忘记一件事情，就是不说并不代表心里不这么想。而且在临床医学上已经充分的告诉我们，越是不说的人，心里头的隐藏的问题一定会越大，因为一个人他必须得到一个最基本的满足，就是他的声音是希望能够被听见的，而声音希望能够被听见，自由的环境就必须先建立起来。
该大胆老儿，竟敢辱骂我家哥哥！来人呐，给我打！
小岛野子呢，在片中特别提到了美国20世纪一个非常知名的心理学家卡尔罗杰斯。卡尔他出生在一个虔诚的基督教家庭哦，那他本来是前往纽约念结合神学院，那后来呢，在参加一次国际的基督徒青年大会呢，反而起心动念转变，改往攻读心理学哈，转变了他的职业生涯的规划。那卡尔罗杰斯的理论架构其实深受基督教的一个影响。他认为上帝造人的特性呢，治疗者都应该是用无条件的正向关怀和同理心来对待当事人哈。其实因为我自己在教会里是专门教维吉尼亚·萨提尔女士的家族治疗课哈，那我们也谈很多亲子或夫妻之间的对话方式。我发现其实卡尔罗杰斯跟萨提尔维吉尼亚女士呢都有非常高度的相似的本质性，他们都不把任何一个来咨询或者说他们辅导的对象呢，去先界定在于这个人有没有所谓的精神疾病问题。他们认为每个人的心理都是可以去透过好奇去关心、去提问、去了解，一层一层把人真实的感受或想法完整的带出来。好的家庭治疗师，他必须要先做到一件事情，就是不带批判的去倾听，并且能够去带出人真实的感受的时候呢，那么很多时候，其实这个人他自己本身的言论就已经开始产生了一种治愈他自己的功能。好，其实人在一个安全的环境当中，自由的去表达他己身的时候，其实他自己就一直在重组他自己的潜在意识当中的错误或者是风险。人其实会自己去把一个他想要向往的一个好的良善的价值慢慢的重新去表达出来。但是人与人之间难就难在说，又有几个人能够像一般的心理学者一样这么有耐心去倾听别人呢，对吧？所以呢，这也是我必须说，其实言论自由它如果没有办法建立在一个愿意倾听的社会环境当中的时候，其实言论自由某种程度上确实它会越容易流于情绪化或是偏激性这样的字眼。但是这并不代表了言论自由本身是错误的，相对的是我们有没有真的产生更多与人有意义且深刻的对话。这也就是像查理·克克一直主张的，就只有保持对话，人与人之间才有可能停止彼此仇恨。尽管我跟你的看法仍然可以有不同，但是对话是我们唯一联系的桥梁的时候呢，那么我就不会把对方看作是完全的敌人或仇人。因为乔老爷子今天讲的东西其实蛮多，我都可以透过萨提尔的冰山理论以及5种应对姿态呢，我们都可以来更有效的、清楚的、完整去理解乔老爷子今天所谈的这个言论自由的架构，以及其意义。所以如果大家有兴趣的话呢，就多帮我在底下按赞，并且留言告诉我你还想要听到更多关于所谓冰山理论的对话模式，那么我就会考虑专门来做一期这样的节目来跟大家谈，好不好？OK， 很高兴今天跟大家分享这么有意义的影片分享。那如果你是第一次就直接看这部影片的人的话呢， 你可能会对言论自由仍然有很多的怀疑，或者说很多的一些不同的看法，我都还是鼓励你先去看完前面的2期影片，看看那2期影片能不能够解决或者说回答到一些你想要探讨的问题。那因为之前的2期跟这部也有很大的一个不同，所以我已经把它列为言论自由3部曲分1、2、3，我重新把它标签化了。所以你如果打搜寻言论自由的话，基本上你就应该会找到1、2、3的顺序，好不好？那希望这部影片你会喜欢。我们这边是超级神队友，我们就下部影片再见啦，拜拜。
Christ alone.